What you're supposed to do when you wake up in the morning. What you're supposed to do in your life. How do you confront the realities that hit you, whether for the good or for the bad, are ones which give you very little flexibility. Initially, even within the realm of science, in the realm of technology, in our ability to mediate and to relate to the world. We live a life of fate in which our destiny seems almost to be predestined, or to follow a certain path in which we have to buckle our seats. There isn't that much that we could do to dramatically alter our fate. With the transformation of technology, the human being is able to look at nature and reality as a starting point, not as an ending point. What do I want to do about it is a question that I could ask. Travel decades and possibly centuries, and the experience of the modern condition is most aptly characterized by the supermarket. How many bottles of ketchup could you possibly need to choose from? How many? Baked beans, potato chips. Let's, go from foods of necessity to the aisles. What do you need? Which one are you going to take? Transcend ketchup to what do you want to have children? Do you want to have children? When do you want to have children? Which children do you want to have? Or very often, if it's not necessarily which children do you want to have, which children do you not want to have? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? When you say, I am a man or a woman, what did you say? Increasingly, you are saying much, much less, by definition. As each person is confronted with a myriad of choices as to how to express their sexuality, how to express their sense of self, and in what context to fulfill themselves and to fulfill their life choices. Even the term life choices, lifestyles, all represent a human condition in which the reality of choice, the reality of transcending our faith, is a core existential experience. Not just simply, however, when it comes to ketchup, or even when it comes to medicine or travel. We also are choosing the worldview within which we see ourselves and our reality. Human beings think within social structures, and social structures provide for us plausibility structures within which things seem given, certain, true. What happens, however, when we are living in a reality in which we do not simply have to pick the ketchup and potato chip, we also have to pick the institution within which we belong. What framework do we choose to live our life? What do we choose to belong to? And as a result, when you don't have a fixed social structure, a tradition, you don't wake up in the morning and things are given to you. Where you live, what you do when you wake up, what you belong to, where you go to. When there aren't fixed social structures, there are also no fixed realities which reinforce the plausibility structures through which you achieve various levels of certainty. What do you have to do? Just about nothing. What do you choose to do? If, and I'll quote Peter Berger, for pre-modern man, heresy is a possibility, usually a rather remote one. For modern man, heresy typically becomes a necessity. Or again, modernity creates a new situation in which picking and choosing becomes an imperative. Now suddenly, heresy no longer stands out against a clear background of authoritative tradition. The background has become dim or even disappeared. As long as that background was still there, individuals had the possibility of not picking and choosing. They could simply surrender to the taken-for-granted consensus that surrounded them on all sides, and that is what most individuals did. But now this possibility itself becomes dim or disappears. How can one surrender to a consensus that is socially unavailable? We need to pick. We need to choose. We need to choose amongst the myriad of options that we have either created or which we now see as plausible for us. Now, what does that do to a life of faith? The first, most obvious thing is that faith is not obvious. It's not the obvious go-to space which either explains the world for you or resolves its conflicts or provides you with the tools which you need in order to live your life. It's but one option. And part of the dilemma of faith is the fact that which grows out of its, number one, not being self-evident, and two, having to function within a life in which the social plausibility structures of a life of faith don't necessarily seem to be that compelling. One of the challenges of, for example, an ultra-Orthodox or certain fundamentalist perspectives is how do I transport the human being into another space and time in which there is no counter-plausibility structure. There is no counter-option. And when the Khatam Sofer says, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, what he is basically saying is, I want to go back, give me some of that old-time religion, give me that reality. It's not that I'm frightened of the new possibility or the new idea. It's the fact that there is no given on which I can count anymore. And I want to recreate a world in which all the choices, and more significantly, all the counter-plausibility structures are deemed to be implausible. And the only place you live is within a social structure which supports and creates the myth of certainty that plausibility structures could provide as a safety net or as the foundation of faith. But if we don't live in such a world, how is faith possible? Or more importantly, and with this I'd like to focus my remarks this morning, what are some of the core challenges to an individual making a choice to believe? Bracket for now, believe in what? Personally, I don't really care. And there's probably nothing that anybody could say about believe in what that will be any value. We all believe or don't believe what it is that we don't or do believe, or need to or don't need to believe. And like the rabbi or teacher who speaks about God or about the object of faith in the precise terms which mirrors that which we already believe. Oh, Rabbi, I loved your speech. I agreed with every word of it. What to believe, different classes will struggle. That's your private journey. Every one of us does it differently, finds a little nuance. And if we're lucky, we also find a social structure in which the particular thing that we create feels normal. It's very, very alienating to have to try to live within one plausibility structure of faith in a social environment for which it is as if conferences like this is to make you feel normal. We're the majority. Where's there a layperson? Let you dare come in. You know, this is our space. Here I don't have to pretend. What? They'll be here later. But then we'll talk about Israel. But you know what I mean. How do you get up in the morning? And what about you? What about you? And I know one of the things that that so deeply affected me and taught me this year with RLI, when we were talking about questions of the role of the rabbi in performing intermarriages. And the thing that I never understood, is that it doesn't, for the rabbi, and this is what my colleagues taught me, is that it's not only about what's good for the Jewish people. It's also about what's good for me. I'm a rabbi. What could I do? What is my authenticity? I'm not necessarily making an argument, is this good for the Jews, bad for the Jews? Will more Jews be in? Will less Jews be in? All of the above. There's lots of questions. But I don't know if I could always be sacrificed on an altar. It's me too. And how do I find a way that I can get up in the morning? And how do I function with one system of principles and concern and try to balance something in a world in which the depth of my pain and struggle is not experienced? Now, in the world of faith, here too, very often, not exclusively, but very often there is a huge gap. But one of the core challenges, if there is a heretical imperative, whether we like it or not, there isn't a core singular social structure creating a belief system which is given, which we can follow by mere virtue of the fact that it is tradition. And we have to choose. We choose between options for reasons. And we don't choose certain options for certain reasons. And if faith is going to be something that we choose, the question is whether faith can be a compelling option. One of the great challenges to a life of faith is the question whether, if when I enter into this system, do I have to leave my brain aside? And that's the theme that I would like to address this morning under the title of Faith and Reason. Does faith provide an alternative notion of truth? Does faith provide an alternative science? An alternative definition of what constitutes reason? And if I am committed to one, to a scientific or committed to my own system of reason and rationality, does faith require of me to relinquish that completely? Now, increasingly, and here, those of you who are in the United States, this is increasingly part of the central conversation about faith in the public sphere. The people who speak in the language of faith say, I have another truth. Creationism is science, and it's not the issue of state and religion. It's not a question of state and religion. It's a question, if my faith provides me with a different level of certainty, why isn't it as legitimate as evolution? Neither is the definition of family or abortion, or numerous other questions, and we're going to talk about that later this evening. These are issues that are hitting the public sphere, and the classic distinction between state and religion is not working. Because religion in the public sphere is not a question of church and state. America has a distinction between church and state. There is no distinction between religion and state. And again, I'm going to come back to that this evening. Now, if my religion provides a different notion of knowledge, of the good, of what is true, the barrier between church and state is simply inadequate. And if a response to certain evangelical positions might be, excuse me, you're violating church and state, it's not going to hold over time. What conversation do we Jews, how do we Jews talk about faith and reason? And if a life of faith requires of me to give up on that which I know to be true, then that is a choice that most of our congregants, at least, will choose not to make. Now, when we talk about true or reason, I'd like to make a core distinction between the rational and the reasonable. One simple way to distinguish between them is reasonable. It makes sense to say reasonable for me. You don't say rational to me or for me. Rational pertains to that area which we believe to be objectively true. True to me, true to you, true in this context and true in another one. True in this era and true in another one. Now, the consequence of scientific advancement makes us recognize that things will never be impervious to change and impervious to criticism. But in the realm of the rational, the human condition leaps from one position of rational to another and lands within the rational, lands back in a new moment of universal knowledge in which what we believe to be true is true now. And I might change that which I believe to be rational, but I will only do so on the basis of arguments which themselves I believe to be a rational process. If you want to convince me otherwise, you have to do so through reason, which is very often embedded within the foundation of the rational itself. There might be something new that now I know, but now that I know it to be true. Now, the fact that somebody else doesn't ascribe truth to it is meaningless to me when I define it as rational. It just simply means that they are what? Wrong. It simply means that they're wrong. Now, I might be enough of a pluralist to let somebody else be wrong. I might be willing to tolerate people who are wrong. But the one thing that doesn't change is the fact that they're wrong. One area of knowledge, and it's heavily laden in the areas of science, though not exclusively. There are also moral dimensions to the rational, where we experience something as universal, as true. And somebody else arguing to the contrary doesn't undermine my certainty. It becomes a sociological fact, not an epistemological challenge. The second domain is the domain of the reasonable. Here we're not as certain. If we're certain, the certainty is localized. I am certain that this is true to me. It's reasonable to me. I don't assume that the person who disagrees with me is necessarily wrong. I might not want to live like that person. I might be very, very committed. Very often, things that are reasonable are some of the most important things in my life. But it's reasonable to me, and I don't make a leap to assume that everybody else must comply. Again, on an issue which we'll speak about later tonight. If I look at another society, the denigration of women is irrational. If somebody wants to denigrate women, I don't say, okay, that's your cultural milieu. Just like I don't say anymore, boys will be boys. You're not boys are be boys. Excuse me. You might think boys will be boys, but if boys want to be boys, then under that, you are performing the immoral, then boys are irrational. Under your notion, the boys will be boys. No, there's an objective standard to which we all must comply. But at the same time, while the denigration of women and the marginalization of women may seem clear to me to be irrational, I am fully aware of the fact that there are choices within my social structure which create criteria of reasonableness, which pertain to the interaction between men and women, which a different plausibility structure might create a different one. And my attitude to certain decisions of one community might be very different from others. Now, when it comes to the relationship between faith and the rational, most Jews don't have a problem. Almost. They don't have a problem, but only because they're willing, the notion that faith provides an alternate scientific truth. How does my religion live with science is not an ongoing dilemma in the Jewish community. You don't sense a lot of Jews struggling with 5, 7, 8, 3 and dinosaurs. It's like, it's okay. We can handle it. And we'll see in a moment why. You don't see a lot of synagogues refusing to take children to the Natural History Museum. No, I don't want you to see that. And where we censor the Flintstones. No, that's socially subversive. It's like, that doesn't seem to be a major problem in the Jewish community. It is in the sense that we allow the category of faith to be defined by somebody else and therefore see ourselves as outside. Because if true faith means the acceptance of a different system of truth, and that's what true faith means, then my position is either faithless or less faithful. What does it mean to be faithful? To be full of faith. And if I don't see my position as faithful, and I have an inferiority complex towards someone else who seems to be so far fuller of faith, that they're willing to accept the alternate notion of truth, then we are harming ourselves. Because we're doing what people always do. And that is to define the authentic as that which is outside of them. And consequently undermine on their own sense of validity and authenticity. And create tier 2 religious experiences. But the second challenge, which is very often much deeper and much more relevant in this generation of choice, is, do I have to choose between my faith and what I call reasonable? I could bifurcate faith from the rational. But when I enter into a system of faith, do I have to quiet also that which I feel to be reasonable? Is a life of faith silly? There's a difference between whether a life of faith is wrong and whether a life of faith is silly. And in the modern condition, where it's not God who has changed, but we who have changed, the choice that we will make to whether faith is plausible and therefore possible requires of us to deal both with the challenge of the rational and the challenge of the reasonable. And what I'd like to do is take a walk on the wild side with Maimonides. In yeshiva, that's wild. We're going to be wicked. And I'd like to look at how he struggles with each one of these two questions. And in so doing, set forth a certain category and a certain understanding, which, as to the whole relationship of the plausibility and possibility of faith, as well as how we Jews speak about faith, both to ourselves, to our tradition, and within the public sphere. Maimonides, Guide of the Perplexed, Chapter 2, Part 2, Chapter 25. Know that our shunning the affirmation of the eternity of the world is not due to a text figuring in the Torah according to which the world has been produced in time. Stop. One of the strangest sentences you will read. Read it again. In English. We don't reject the Aristotelian notion of the world being eternal and not created because the Torah says the world was created. I, Maimonides, am confronting a claim of the rational, a claim of science of my generation, in which the creation of the world is by definition a false proposition. Because creation of a world has to presume the existence of a deity who cares and chooses to be involved in this world to create something from nothingness to thingness. The existence of such a God is by definition counter to reason. Because a God by definition must be the transcendent one, and for a transcendent one to be involved in the yachness of this world would be for God to contradict God's godness. The divine cannot be divine if the divine is a creator. This is the argument of Aristotle. It's not God. Therefore, you've created a God who's not a God. I don't know what you've created, but in order for there to be creation, there needs to be a God. And in order for there to be a creation, there needs to be a God who wants to be involved in history. But here too, you've already contradicted yourself. Because a X which is involved in history is by definition not God. And the X that you need to create has to be a God. And therefore the world cannot be created. This is science for Maimonides. This is his significant intellectual other. And he says, I reject it. Not because the Torah says God created the world. What does that mean? What Maimonides in this statement is already declaring is that for me, the Torah is not a source of truth at all. It's not a source of truth. It's not a counter-truth to Aristotle. Why? He says, for the texts indicating that the world has been produced in time are not more numerous than those indicating that the deity has a body. Who here believes that God has a body? Does anybody here believe that God has a body? Don't worry, you won't fail, or we won't kick you out, you'll still get lunch. Does anybody here believe that God has a physical body? See, Maimonides won. It's interesting, right? He says, if I have to look in the Torah, I have a few verses which say that the world was created, and I have tons of verses that say that what? God has a body. And he says, and I don't believe that. So if I don't believe that God has a body, the mere fact that it's in the Torah is not compelling to me. The mere fact that it's written means nothing about its claim for reality. Nor are the gates of figurative interpretation shut in our faces or impossible of access to us regarding the subject of the creation of the world and time. How do I live with faith and the rational? The core instinct of Maimonides is the gates of interpretation. The principle being, and this is very, very important to understand Maimonides' world of faith. Faith in God is deficient to the extent that it undermines the rational. God is truly God, and your relationship with God most complete to the extent that it is in full accord with that which you know. And the way you overcome any possible discrepancy between a life with God and that which you know, which might result from the book, which you might believe is the new science book, is, what words? The gates of interpretation. And therefore, when I come to the book, I don't even start with a conflict, because I never assume that what's written obligates me in the sense of providing a notion of truth. It might obligate me to mitzvah, we'll see that later. But as providing a counter-truth, I don't even look at the book that way. And therefore, whether I accept Aristotle or not has nothing to do with what's written in the book. Why don't I accept Aristotle? Primarily, Maimonides argues, two causes, and we'll look at the first for now. That the deity is not a body has been demonstrated. From this it follows necessarily that everything that in its external meaning disagrees with this demonstration must be interpreted figuratively. For it is known that such texts are of necessity fit for figurative interpretation. However, the eternity of the world has not been demonstrated. Consequently, in this case, the text ought not to be rejected and figuratively interpreted in order to make prevail an opinion whose contrary can be made to prevail by means of various sorts of arguments. If it's just reasonable, if it's not scientific truth, then I could go to my tradition as a completely different person. The voice which says that a commitment to God and faith in God is most deeply found to the extent that God lives in accordance with that which we now know, and in doing so, you have achieved the highest level of faith, is the essence of the Maimonidean claim. One, a voice which is by and large silent in the battle between secularism and faith and its relationship to science. By and large, absent. And book after book, the God delusion, God is not great. And sometimes I read them and I don't know how they became bestsellers. I have to tell you. Because some part of them are just silly. It's just silly. Part of it is silly. What do you mean? The essence of belief in God, if God is the object of faith, then by definition, God must be God, and God could only be God to the extent that God is not deficient. And to ascribe to God that which counters that which you know is to ascribe to God a deficiency. That's Maimonides' worldview. And when he comes to Torah, it's simply not written. There is nothing in our tradition which could ever contradict that which I know. And if you think that it's written, it's only because you are not a person of faith, according to Maimonides. Because faith would obligate you to make the text worthy of being authored by God. And if it contradicts that which we know, then it's not worthy of being authored by God. That is a Maimonidean move which has by and large, captured much of Jewish conversation. Much of Jewish conversation. The only place, as I said, that it has not, is that it is not ascribed to as a higher form of faith. It's sort of a secular version of faith. And in so doing, we're harming our own possibility of faith and its application in our life. Where we have a much greater challenge, as I said, however, is in the realm of the reasonable. I know there were dinosaurs. And I know that the world wasn't started 5,683 years ago. And I don't believe that the devil is really busy prancing around, planting secretly in every carbon testing or however else they test whatever it is, to make the 5683 seem as if it's 4 billion, gazillion, trillion, whatever it is, just to test you to see if you believe. The devil has other things to do. Most significantly, to tease God. That's what keeps the devil busy most. That's just not our problem. And Jews don't wake up in the morning and read Genesis 1 and 2 and feel, oi gewalt. Oi gewalt. I just wish it would have been nice if someone told this to my teacher in grade 2. Because I think the first test I ever failed was what was created on which day. Well, the trees, was that third day? Was that? If I could have come and said, it's just what? It's figurative. I wonder what my mark would have been. If I could have said, here it is for my first ADHD kid having to spit back information. Our brains just don't work that way. And who cared? What happened on the third day? Just didn't matter. Figurative. But they didn't go down. It's maybe because Judaism as an art project needs first day, second day, third. It's a good art project. No, it is. And we have a great religion for art projects. And it's phenomenally conducive to it. Our whole Bible is. So the creation story as art project needs to be taken literal. But once you transcend that and you pass that test, you're basically safe. You're safe. And as Jews, we're not overly angst-filled with the fact that, yes, the earth revolves around the sun. And even though that would seem to undermine the primacy of God and God's creation, we got over it. We got over it. But to understand that the act of getting over it is an act of faith is what Maimonides tells us. But can we get over the fact that we think kashrut is stupid? That's a tougher one. Kashrut is stupid. Oh, what is it everybody knows? What's it called again? What is trigonosis? I'm not getting trigonosis from pork. I could eat pork. It's stupid. Shellfish are too good. And if you want me not to eat them, I need a reason. And it just health just doesn't seem to be reasonable enough. So we Jews try. So one very prominent one is vegetarianism. Kashrut is really about vegetarianism. Now, I don't want to debunk anything that somebody feels is inspiring. I could just tell you from my personal, total, absolute subjectivity. If Judaism wanted to advocate for vegetarianism and picked kashrut as second best, then what should have been limited is the amount you eat, not what you eat. Like, for example, any day you read Torah, shaykh it away. Like, we make it simple. It can't be too complicated, right? Even though this is a religion which tells you don't walk out of your house 2,000 cubits, assuming that you know exactly what is a cubit. So I could have said, eat 2,000 grams of meat a month or a week. If my real instinct was vegetarianism, why do I allow you to eat as much cow as you want? The reason why I'm presenting this is not to create for anybody here a crisis of kashrut. But if we're going to meet the challenge of the reasonable, we're actually going to have to work much, much harder. We're going to need a completely new and perpetually ever-changing exercise of ta'amei mitzvot. One which, by and large, has stopped in the Jewish community. Because for many who observe, they observe despite the fact, because it's unreasonable. And those who want the reason don't observe, so there doesn't seem to be a lot of market share for ta'amei mitzvot. So how do we think about this? And kashrut is just one example, and so too is God. And what comes with it? Does the challenge of the Holocaust or suffering or chaos challenge my notion of the rational, or does it challenge my notion of the reasonable? Does Shabbat? Does Jewish peoplehood? Does loyalty to the state of Israel? Is it reasonable? And how all of us have to function, it was so much easier when Jews woke up in the morning and it was self-evident. You belonged to a shul. And no one asked why. You supported Israel and no one asked why. Judaism is your people and nobody asked why. I have multiple other options and people are asking why. And in the realm of faith and a relationship with God, when God enters into the room, does it require me to shift what I think is reasonable? Please turn to chapter 3, part 3, chapter 31. There is a group of human beings, Maimonides says, who consider it a grievous thing that causes should be given for any law. They don't want ta'amei mitzvot. They don't like it. Why don't they like ta'amei mitzvot? What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. Now, Maimonides was a really, really nice, interesting, creative mind. Actually, no. He was a really, really, really creative mind. He wasn't a nice man. Nor was he overly tolerant, as you're about to see. So those people who don't want to find a reason for the commandments, Maimonides says, what compels them to feel thus is a sickness that they find in their souls, a sickness to which they are unable to give utterance and of which they cannot furnish a satisfactory account. For they think that if those laws were useful in this existence and had been given to us for this or that reason, it would be as if they derived from the reflection and understanding of some intelligent being. If, however, there is a thing for which the intellect could not find any meaning at all and does not lead to something useful, it undoubtedly derives from God. Faith is at its core an exercise of leaping. It's not that faith requires a leap of faith. The exercise of faith entails the act of leaping. The leaping over your reason to become faithful and to allow a system of faith to give you both truth, knowledge, and all categories of reasonableness which are to define your life, and the extent to which you quiet your own soul, the extent to which you're able to leap over that which you know and that which you feel, to that extent you are more full of faith. Maimonides looks at such a person and says, you're not full of faith, you're full of sickness. There's something wrong because you have a deficient God. God must not only, according to Maimonides, comply completely with the system of the rational, God must also comply completely with the system of the reasonable. And he continues and says, but God, he is far exalted above this. The contrary is the case. The whole purpose consisting in what is useful for us, as we have explained, on the basis of its dictum, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. And it says, which shall hear all these statutes, even the chukim, and say, surely this great community is a wise and understanding people. The nations of the world are supposed to be able to look at what we do and to say, that's reasonable. Without a presumption of truth, without a presumption of observance, without anything, you're supposed to be able to look at Torah and to say, this makes sense. And the more I feel that this makes sense, the more I recognize that the source of this system is what? Is God. This is the religious world of Maimonides. The big problem with 331 is, how do you apply it? 225, I'm with you. 225 is insulated. There is no counterfactual. Because the mere fact that something is proven requires of me to recognize that whatever is written in the Bible that contradicts that which is proven is not written in the Bible. But here, the judge is not my interpretive process, what do I keep in the book or take out of the book. It's there, and everybody is supposed to see it as rational, as reasonable, as making sense. But does it? Does it make sense? Does kashrut make sense? Does circumcision, depending on which New England journal came out when and where, does that what's making sense? Is that compelling? Is it so self-evident? Maimonides understood the difficulty of his position, and therefore 331 is followed by 332. Maimonides starts 332 with an analysis of the reality of nature, in which he argues for the principle of gradation. In nature, things don't go from one extreme to the next. They can't. And therefore, for example, in the middle, he says, the brain is an example of the gradation of the motion and the proximity of the limbs of an individual. For its front part is soft, very soft indeed, whereas its posterior part is more solid. The spinal marrow is even more solid, becomes more and more solid as it stretches out. The nerves are organs of sensation, of motion. Accordingly, the nerves require only for apprehension by the senses or for motion that present but little difficulty, like the motions of the eyelid or the jaws, proceed from the brain. Whereas the motions required for moving limbs proceed from the spinal marrow. As it is, however, impossible for a nerve, in view of its softness, even for a nerve proceeding from the spinal marrow, to move an articulation, the matter was willily and graciously arranged as follows. The nerves are ramified into fibers, and the latter, having filled with flesh, become muscles. Thereupon the nerve, having overpassed the extremity of the muscle, having become more solid and become more commingled with the fragments of ligaments, become a tendon. The tendon joins and adheres to the bone, and thereupon, because of this gradation, the nerve is capable of moving a limb. Okay? I'm assuming, given the training of most people here, we don't have a clue what he's talking about. And so if you read this in your shul, do so with a caveat, So I have no idea. You might want to just check with someone, true, not true. I have no idea, nor does it really matter to me, as long as I can move my limbs. But the basic principle is a nerve can't be asked to move a limb unless something else happens to enable my little pishy nerve to acquire other stuff and able to move my arm. You need gradation. That which exists in nature, Maimonides argues, also exists in the way God governed human beings. Many things in our law, are due to something similar to this very governance on the part of God who governs. May God be glorified and exalted. For a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. Not only can we not move from a nerve to the moving of a limb, we as human beings also can't shift from one reality to another reality without transition. And man or woman, according to their nature, are not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which they were accustomed. And since God sent Moses, our master, to make out of us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, etc., so that we should serve and devote ourselves to God's worship, according to what God has said. And as at that time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world, and the universal service upon which we were brought up consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up, in worshiping the latter and in burning incense before them, the pious ones and the ascetics being, at that time, as we have explained, the people who were devoted to the service of these temples consecrated to the stars, God's wisdom, may God be exalted, and God's gracious ruse, which is manifest in regards to all of God's creatures, did not require that God give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, and abolition of all these kinds of worship. For one could not then conceive the acceptance of such a law, considering the nature of human beings, which always likes that to which it is accustomed. And consequently, a few sentences down, thereupon God, may God be exalted, suffered the above-mentioned kind of worship to remain, but transferred them from created or imagery or imaginary and unreal things to God's own name, may God be exalted, commanding us to practice them with regards to God, may God be exalted. 331 says, for Torah to be Torah, everybody has to see it as purposeful. So now what about what about sacrifice? Half of the 613 commandments talk about sacrifice. Is that which Maimonides believes to be not irrational, unreasonable, silly. It's silly. What you're going to talk to God through a she-ass or a bull? It's like on your own, read 351. That's not the way you get closer to God. Closest to God is dependent on your understanding. It's not dependent on how many sheep you bring. What do you think? God needs your sheep? It's silly. And Maimonides looks at half of Torah and says, this is simply silly. So how does he explain it? And in so doing, has a move which is critically important and around which the differences between Orthodoxy, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Post-denominational, and secular, all of them could be mapped. Maimonides says what I need for me as a human being is I have to know not only that I'm not doing something silly, I have to know that my God is not silly. Is my God an idiot? Is my God primitive? Now, if God commands sacrifices, God's silly. Maimonides then introduces the notion that a perfect God cannot give a perfect Torah if that perfect God is speaking to an imperfect people. And that the content of Torah is not determined by God, but is determined by the audience. It's determined by the audience, and it's determined by their time. Now everybody reads Maimonides and they want to know, so how in his Mishnah Torah does he keep sacrifices as a commandment? Why does he even keep sacrifices in the Messianic era? Get rid of them. And then people speak about two different Maimonides. Maimonides, your Maimonides, etc. Everybody has their little, it's this one. Who was the real one? Was it the God of the guide or the God? Who was the Maimonides? What's the real one? And if they're integrated or not integrated. I think what 332 is offering is a different notion of what it means to live with the traditional which is reasonable. Maimonides argues, I could do that which I believe is unreasonable, as long as I believe that God was reasonable in doing so, and my reason for keeping it is simply tradition. When you try to tell me that I have to keep sacrifices because that's the better way to do it, a la Nachmanides, for example, in Vayikra, you lose me. Don't give me crappy tamei mitzvot. Don't infantilize me. Speak to me straight. And as long as you were reasonable, I could live with you, because it's perfectly reasonable to say, I'm able to do things even if it's not meaningful to me, because maybe I have a position that I don't want to change tradition, or I only want to change tradition very rarely. It's when you give me that which is unreasonable, masked under the aura of reasonableness, then you lose me. Now, differences between denominations are exactly on what is the consequence of the imperative of the reasonable. And for Maimonides, being reasonable is an imperative, not just rational, also reasonable. We need a Judaism which shines forth. Now, it's obvious that 331 is unimplementable in its totality, but it's a nice yearning. It's not fully implementable, but we can get close. For Maimonides, in his world, I can get close as long as much of Torah is reasonable, and that which wasn't was reasonable at one time. Different denominations have a different explanation or a different consequence of the imperative, the reasonable, and institute halachic change in order to make a religion or a life of faith be commensurate with what does reason require. And the great challenge that we all face is to ensure that if we do change, we're only changing that which is unreasonable, or we're actually trying to explain correctly a tamei mitzvot, where the purpose of tamei mitzvot is to inspire observance, not to serve as the foundation for inobservance. Because if I give a tam to a mitzvah, which by definition makes it irrelevant, but makes it only relevant in one time, but there might have been another tam. Like one of the better examples of a new tamei mitzvot is Heshel Shabbat, which completely moves the domain of Shabbat into a modern society and doesn't feel that, turning on the light switch, was that work or not work, and realizes that you need a completely different category. Oh, it wasn't so hard. So what do we do with our tamei mitzvah? That very often is whether do we want to create the reasonable, or do we want to free ourselves from that which we're defining as unreasonable. There's people who do it better and people who do it worse. There's people with greater integrity with people with less integrity. One of our challenges very often is how do we, as people of integrity, function with many people who have less integrity than we. And they do. But the challenge itself, if we look at this process of faith and reason and we use Maimonides as a paradigm. I want to read together one short section from Maimonides' Introduction to Perek Chelek, and with that conclude and open up for any questions. If we want to understand and encapsulate what is the life of faith that Maimonides is calling for, or what does faith mean for him? Chapters, page 17. Nevertheless, even though this is the end we seek, even though we seek to live in the world to come, a person who wishes to serve God out of love should not serve God in order to attain the world to come. This person should rather, if you want to serve God out of love, what do? You should believe that wisdom exists, and that this wisdom is commensurate with the Torah, is the Torah. And the Torah was given by prophets by God, their Creator, and that in the Torah God taught us virtues which are commandments and vices that are sins. In so doing, now as a decent human being, what does it mean to worship God out of love? It's to keep Torah, for you desire that as a decent human being, one must cultivate the virtues and avoid the sins. And in so doing, you will perfect the specifically human which resides in you, and will be genuinely different from the animals. Skip 5 lines. This is the meaning of the verse. Be not as the horse or as the mule, which has no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle. Restraints which prevent animals from acting in accordance with their nature are external ones, like the bit and the bridle. With man or woman, the influences which restrain us are our control of self. This is what it means to love God. This is what it means to live with God at the highest level. What then is this dilemma of faith? Or how do we overcome a dilemma of faith? How do we create a plausibility structure to actualize a choice in which faith becomes an integral part of my life? When it comes to faith and the rational, to in its deepest sense understand that any perceived contradiction is an act of faithlessness and not an act of faithfulness. And you support your faithfulness through the medium of the gates of interpretation. And you have a task to ensure that God is God. Why is God making life so difficult for you? Read the whole introduction to chapter Chelek where God, I have to talk in a language that human beings could understand. But you, a life of faith and a life of rationalism, have to be completely assimilated within. There is no counter-truth. And a voice of Jews speaking about the relationship between faith and reason as an expression of faith is a powerful witness that needs to be heard. When it comes to faith and reason, the challenge is not to the world, the challenge is to ourselves. How do we build a religious life in which faith is completely commensurate with the path of reasonable on which I choose to embark? How do we create a human being for whom there is no leap of faith? Because the highest level of love of God is a complete internalization. I don't leap anywhere. I don't transcend myself. I love God to the best, in the deepest sense, when I find a way to recognize that Torah is fully commensurate with that which I believe to be reasonable. Now, how do we create such a Judaism? We create such a Judaism depends on who you are. For some, it will obligate you. It's not a right. For some, it is a duty of removing the unreasonable. In some cases, it's the duty to create a new world of Tamei Mitzvot. And in some cases, it's expressed and exhausted by The fact that your search for reason is not always a search for reason for you, but a search for reason for God. And then the life of and the relationship between faith and reason is not a moment in time which enables you in a world of choice and heretical imperative to say, yes, I will enter into this system, or I could see myself in this system. It's a life journey. It's a never-ending process. The choices always aren't made at one moment in time. They're perpetual choices. And the extent to which you make the a priori decision that faith and reason will walk together, then you not only make possible the choice of faith, you create a completely different path for what it means to be a person of faith. We need a different anthropology for what a person of faith means. What do they look like? How do they conduct themselves? How do they see themselves? What happens when faith enters into the equation? What baggage do you carry and what baggage do you not carry? Maimonides offers us a vision of what that may look like. One which that I wanted to share with you. And one which, as we begin our seminar on faith, its dilemmas, what does it mean? Who is God? What difference does God make when it comes to politics? What difference does God make when it comes to ethics? How do we educate a community to be communities of faith? What does this enterprise mean? The critical decision, the juncture that we have to make, which enables this process of faith, is to redefine the inner relationship between faith and reason. Now, are there any questions as we conclude? Let me just see hands. Let me just see where we are. 1, 2, 3, 4. Got it. Okay, we're going to start. I think I saw a hand. Yes, please. Say that. I didn't understand the question. I apologize.
What is the pursuit of Tamei Mitzvah, which the Rambam speaks about elsewhere? Wouldn't that really enable a person to really distance themselves from that synthesis of becoming a person of faith and a person of reason?
I feel like I have an answer, but I didn't feel that I understand the question. No, and so I don't want to. Because I'm just gonna one line and then because I still didn't understand the question. For him, for Maimonides, the process of Tamei Mitzvot is the way in which you integrate the two. So that's why I didn't. There's something that you're saying that I'm not comprehending. I apologize.
Tamei Mitzvot is really only, which you said earlier, where you can actually create a falsehood of really what is going on with the mitzvah. It really you're abandoning what the potential leap of faith could be, right?
You give up on that, right?
You're giving up on it. And if you want to create a certain reality for yourself based on, and you could kind of couch it in Tamei Mitzvot, it doesn't necessarily have to be that, and the Rambam says that elsewhere. That really is only a vehicle by which you're going to attach yourself deeper to the mitzvah. But what you're ostensibly doing is distancing yourself from what the true goal should be, which should be having this leap of faith, and then understanding that these Tamei Mitzvot are really just a route to allow you to have some.
Okay, now I understand. Thank you. Here we disagree. Here we just simply disagree. It's not a matter of right or wrong. Let me be very clear. There's just a core disagreement. Tamei Mitzvot are Tamei Mitzvot a ruse, or Tamei Mitzvot that which saves a life of faith? It's that which makes faith possible. Now here too, there is no doubt, when you walk on the path of Tamei Mitzvot, you set yourself up for disappointment. You do. And there is no doubt that the path of Tamei Mitzvot, ultimately, I believe this very deeply, that if you really integrate the path of Tamei Mitzvot completely in your life, at least the possibility of halachic change becomes stronger. There's a danger of that. It's true. Now, Maimonides in 332 says, I'm not doing it. I'm not changing it because I don't need it. As long as it made sense, I could keep on doing it. And I believe that that decision is reasonable. But it's a reasonable decision. A commitment to tradition could be a reasonable statement. But it's different saying, I'm making that statement, and then saying, yes, it's also reasonable. Now, how are you half in Tamei Mitzvot and half in tradition at the same time? Maimonides tried to do both. Whether a person can or not is a serious question. And I think the reality of Jewish life shows that it's not a simple balance. And where people take the stand and where they don't. The changes taken place in the role of women. I'm talking, and again, even within Orthodoxy, are evident of how every community has a challenge of reasonableness. But how we balance it and how different Jews balance it. But there is no doubt. Once you recognize, and this is, I would answer, see, it's not dangerous because of the heretical imperative. See, if you're living in a world in which there is no heretical imperative, shut up. People are happy. Who asked you? Like, what, did you woke up in the morning and needed it? Like, leave me alone. I felt good. My life was just fine. I didn't need. The problem is that our current reality, for many, I would argue for almost all of our congregants, is that there's almost no givens. And in that reality, then the process of searching for ever-increasing relationships between faith and reason, finding ways to redefine that relationship, creating aspirations which are journeys you walk on, make the possibility of choosing faith greater in our universe than not. In another universe, it might be it might just be a ruse. In our generation, it's not a ruse, it's a lifeline. Or at least that's what I would argue. There were two hands here, and then I saw. You put your down, yes. I'm just going to, yes, please.
One of the more compelling concepts that I heard along the way in studying with our teacher, Dr. Steve, was his expression of the non-rational, in which I think, if I understood it and understand it, he was trying to create a midway for those of us. If you look at this mitzvah, that mitzvah, or tradition as it's developed, and if we analyze it, we'll come to the conclusion that it's neither rational nor reasonable. But if we create this sort of leap of faith that gives our human approach and our human psychological needs voice, and we honor that, which the Reform movement thinking was more reticent
To do, yes.
and we classify it as non-rational, as we not irrational, but non-rational, then it will be easier for us to enhance our lives through this practice.
Very nice.
Anyway.
Is the story you just told not a story of turning the non-rational into the reasonable? You just speaking about the human condition and our need. It basically. Now, we could even go further, and there is other non-rational in which we recognize that to be truly rational is to also know that there's domains that you don't know. That is also to include it in different languages, and it's part of the process of expanding the categories of the rational and the reasonable to encompass all aspects. There can't be even when you make the leap, you make it in very specific places which are guided by rational thought, because the non-rational is allowed to enter to the extent that you recognize the limits of human knowledge, and your willingness to embrace some of it as a rational expansion of human life. And thus the spiritual, etc., and the transcendent enter into through a rational or a reasonable argument. But they never lead you to completely relinquish the domain of the rational, in particular when tradition contradicts. It's one thing when religion is pointing to an area that you want to argue is reasonable to assume it exists. The black hole of the human intellectual capacity. The recognition that there's more there than that I could see and feel, and that my desire to connect to that more. It's there. I can't define, but I know it's like what I could see because it's there. But that's very different. And what Maimonides is trying to do, and in many ways, much of the struggle of contemporary discourse, or part of the struggle of contemporary, is what happens when it contradicts reason, not when it expands and opens up for me other notions of what's reasonable. There was a hand. Yes, please.
You may have actually sort of almost answered it in some of your previous answers, but I was wondering about the gates of interpretation and the limits of it. Maimonides employs great creativity, not only about the physicality of God and the brain of OP, but even the emotional states ascribed to God. And I was curious about where you place the limits. You know, the limits from your perspective on the gates of interpretation.
No limits.
Oh.
Never. There's no limits, nor can there be. It's your gate, just like it's my gate. It's all of our gates. And once the principle is recognized, that God is God only to the extent that God is commensurate with the rational, then there could be the only limit is to make sure that there is no contradiction. In other words, it's not, for Maimonides, it's not even there. It's not even a creative move. It wasn't there in the first place. Your assumption that it's there because it's written is your problem. Being written doesn't mean that it's there. Could you understand that point? Being written doesn't mean that it's there. Whoa, it's not there. You just have to make sure that other people recognize that it's not there. And there might have been a lot of other reasons in which it assumes, or you might think that it's there. So there is no limit to reinforcing that which is not there. You see, because if you think about it, I'm not changing. It's just not there. So how could there be a limit to inhibit? It can't be there. Anything you have to do to make sure that people see that it's really not there is what enables you to show what Torah is. So there are no limits. Where are there limits? There are limits in the reasonable. And then it depends on the person. Depends on what you define as reasonable. Depends on what you believe are the consequences of when something is unreasonable. But the journey to create a religion of reason as a sacred journey, completely supported by a life of interpretation, that's the world that Maimonides paints for us. Yes, Dave?
So at the end of the day, then, how do you define it as monotheism? Because taken to its logical conclusion, it brings us away, it brings us out, it can bring us very far from each other. So what holds the center? Where does the authority lie? It's not in reasonableness as defined by each one of us.
See, I don't know why you would argue. There's two separate questions. How do I define it as monotheism? And the other one is, what is the core? Did I understand the question correctly?
Yes.
They're two separate questions, right? I don't understand the first one because there could be one God. I understand the second question. Could you elaborate on the first part? Because I don't. Or should I skip the first part? Okay. No, it's because there is none. Now, for Maimonides, there was. Because he was willing to live within a halachic community in which he could live, he was committed sufficiently to halakha, and he recognized that halakha doesn't have to only inspire him, as long as it was reasonable at one time. That is Maimonides. God can't be unreasonable, and then I'm not being insulted. And so for him, he creates a community of halakha. For other Jews, for whom, and all of us are on different spectrums of it, there is no doubt that cohesive Jewish collective life becomes increasingly difficult, and the process of the changing or the plurality of choices of modernity also creates plurality of denominations and plurality of sub-denominations and plurality of minions within the survey and plurality of institutions, all of which lead us to the profound question of what does it even mean to be together. There is no doubt that that's where it leads, but that's not a byproduct of this move. It's just, again, it's not like God changed. We're at another place. The notion that we are all going to be together the way we used to be together is just over. Now, you could mourn it. You could feel bad about it. It just is. What together? Listen, we all know, and I don't mean to sound like, so totally modern, because I don't like to do that, but like, what it even means to have friends today. It's very, very different. I know a lot of people who have friends. I don't know what it means exactly. I'm really working on getting on Facebook. My problem is psychologically, I don't understand it. No, that's my problem. I don't psychologically get it. I can intellectually get it. I don't it just doesn't deliver any return to me, and therefore there's nobody I want to follow that way. It's like, no, I just don't. And I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong. I'm just saying I just don't understand it. But that's what it is. We're different friends. What Jewish community means is different. What does it mean to belong to a synagogue? It's just going to be different. And that's all that we have so many modernity, and the heretical imperative of modernity trumps every feature of our lives, every single feature of our lives, in which you have nothing, which there is no given tradition that you could assume that the people you're speaking to are limited by. But all that aside, the one question that we're struggling with these 2 weeks is, where is faith in that story? Now, this story of faith is not undermining our collective. Our collective is undermined. The question is whether our changed, undermined, very, very different collective could develop a narrative about faith which makes it plausible to keep it in the discourse. And whether when we speak about faith, do we immediately go to the leap of faith? And then whether, if you're willing to leap with me, you leap, or whether the process of the rational and the reasonable get integrated perpetually within to enable those individuals for whom those categories are critical to have faith as a continual part of their discourse. I think I saw, yes, please, ma'am. Yeah, the last two hands, and then we'll conclude. Yes, please. What's your name, please? Malka. The answer to that question is only answered by Malka. If you claimed it was rational, then you'd be in my space, because you'd be going from Malka to me, because you'd be saying not only what Malka feels, you'd also be saying what Donniel ought to feel. But if you're claiming that the category of Tzelem Elohim, that to live a life of faith is to see that within each human being there is an essence of the infinite which gives both to all human beings equal value, but also all human beings infinite potential. Whatever Tzelem Elohim does for you, that's a language of reasonableness, which is Malka's world. And the only one who owns the king of Malka and queen of Malka's world is Malka. And Malka will be a successful rabbi to the extent that Malka's spiritual language resonates with a community that Malka could be the rabbi of. And Malka can't be a rabbi of every community, nor does she want to be. But she has to be the rabbi of a right community. And so the challenge of reasonableness, it's your decision. But the imperative is to answer the question. Unless it's part of where it's reasonable to know that you don't know. But then that's also part of reason. And it's always very, very limited. Because in contemporary journeys of adding the infinite, the unknown, the mysterious into our lives, it's not to allow the mysterious to take over every dimension of life, but to recognize that a life without mystery is a life which maybe is irrational. But that's, again, part of that reasonable. But that's Malka's Judaism. Malka has to tell that story and then teach it. Last question. Yes, but
If the fact that it's written means it's not even there, or we've been talking about rationality, and how does Maimonides understand where did rationality come from judaically, or does he just acknowledge? I don't think he acknowledged what he got it from Aristotle, or did he?
he acknowledges. But for him, the rational, and it continues. I have a very fine book by Thomas Nagel, and I'm just blanking on its name, where the whole struggle of epistemology over the generations is to try to know what it is that we know. Maimonides lived in a time where it was much easier to assume and to make a claim of certainty. You claim this is certain, this is what we know, and that's fine. The problem with the progression of time is that the realm of the rational has been increasingly it's increasingly shrinking as we know more and more what it is that we don't know. And therefore, what is it that I'm willing to say I know and that I'm willing to ascribe to all is getting smaller and smaller. They're still there. So there are multiple currents in epistemology. Do we give it up completely? Is everything subjective? There is no category of rational, all there is a category of reasonable? Like, does that really articulate? Is it reasonable? Like, I have a toothache. Is that real or not real? Or is that a category of irrational or reason? Is that something that I know or don't know? Do I know that it's wrong to murder Malka, right? Do I know it, or was it just it's reasonable? If I would say it's reasonable not to murder Malka, somewhere you would feel that the language, I wasn't accurate. So how it is that we know that which we know, nobody knows. That's the truth. Nobody knows. And as a result, there's always room for the skeptic to say you know nothing. And there is no absolute argument to convince the skeptic not to be a skeptic. But most of us within the world, within our lives, have a claim of a rational, assume it, live by it. It follows procedures of reason, could get challenged and overturned. Maimonides, it was much easier. Today, it's more narrow. So in the realm of science, again, there too, what people claim to know or not know. But it's there. That rational, and it's critical that religion never go up against that which you feel is universal. And Maimonides says it never does because it was never there. On the reasonable, it's not that religion can come up against it. It's our challenge to build a religion which lives in unison with it. That is not, that the decision to create such a religion is in many ways the ultimate response to the heretical imperative. Welcome again, and thank you very much.